Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so in this episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the seminal 1954 novel Lord of the Flies, written by the English author William Golding. Oh, and if you don't know, the book is about a group of boys whose airplane crashes on an uninhabited island somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The story is about their attempt to govern themselves without any adults around. Now, that sounds pretty fun and exciting, right? I mean, nothing but beaches and shells and not a grown-up in sight. Well, it doesn't quite turn out that way. No, needless to say, the results are pretty much disastrous. Anyway, so in what follows, I want to try to explore a couple of major themes in the story. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Okay, so I would say that Lord of the Flies is probably most essentially about the importance of order and structure within a community, and also about the necessity of order for morality. But to make this clear, let's start at the beginning. So notice that at the start of their being adrift on this island, everything seems to be going pretty well for the boys. I mean, they successfully create their own social system. Ralph is chosen to be the leader, and this is done democratically. They use a conch shell to speak, which is the symbol of authority at that moment. And of course, they keep a fire going in the hopes of being detected. But then what happens is that the choir boy Jack dissents, and he gathers his own group of hunters. They start to hunt pigs for meat, and they start enjoying those hunts and the violence that comes along with it. Liberated from their social selves now, they kill without guilt whatever gets in their way. Then Jack overthrows Ralph as the leader, and with him all humane rules. And of course, the death or the murder of both Piggy and Simon put the ultimate stamp on such transgression. I mean, as it's pretty clear, these two characters, Piggy and Simon, are highly symbolic. That is, they symbolize something like the philosophical or the rational in the case of Piggy, and the religious or the mystical in the case of Simon. Well, okay, so why are their deaths significant exactly? Well, because in their own way, they both symbolize transparency and order and structure. And so they are the two great deterrents blocking the slide into hell or chaos. With them out of the picture, there are no more limitations. There is no more reasonable dialogue. Actually, it's interesting. When Piggy is killed, he's actually holding the shell. And in this moment, Golding makes sure to emphasize the fact that as Piggy is struck by the rock, the shell breaks into 1,000 pieces, never to be put back together again. Again, the point is that order has been smashed, and it's given way to complete unbridled license. But of course, I think that Golding's larger point is that there is the potential for crude self-interest and evil in the human heart. And that the evidence for this is what happens when you take people out of their political or their social order. What happens is that people begin to compete with one another, and they resort to their most base self-serving impulses, and so they transgress boundaries. No, human nature is not so obviously essentially good. Human nature has a strong tendency to selfishness, which in certain circumstances, like being stuck on an island with no rule or authority, is all too willing to harm others unjustly. Actually, it's really interesting. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes understood something like this. I mean, in his great work, The Leviathan, he imagines a situation way back in our prehistory where there was no civilization, which is to say basically no government and no central authority to enforce its power on others. Famously, he called this situation the state of nature. Now, the thing about this place for him was that it was the worst place that you could ever be in. That is, this state of nature amounted to nothing but a war of all against all, in which the life of human beings was nothing but nasty, brutish, and short. Now, why would this be the case exactly? Well, because for Hobbes, we all seek to maximize self-interest. And so we will ruthlessly compete with others for whatever goods are available. And of course, these are very scarce. So you see how individuals here are going to be pretty much badly off. In such a dire situation, everyone is competing to gain as much as they can, which is to say, to gain at the expense of others. Such an all-out competition is bound to be difficult for everybody. Without cooperation and without trust, you just have, well, chaos and disorder. Now, Hobbes believed that the solution to this lay in what he called the social contract, which was basically a kind of compromise on our part to enter into, well, a contract or a set of rules whereby we agree that we won't harm each other and so on. And we make sure that this happens by agreeing to establish an agency, basically the state or a government, with the power to enforce punishment on transgressors if need be. And actually, this is exactly what fell apart with the boys in the Lord of the Flies. When they strayed from Ralph, their central leader or authority figure, their situation totally spiraled downhill into a battleground of competing factions, each contending for as much power as possible. And, well, basically, a war of all against all was the consequence. Anyway, okay, so I want to mention another point here, not unrelated to what I was just saying. So what's really interesting is how it is most of the boys take the opposite of authority to be freedom. Which, by the way, is not surprising. I mean, I think many of us think the same way, right? But anyway, the boys take freedom to lie in the stepping away from or in the violation of the established rules and order. Now, it's true in one sense that they do liberate themselves from this. But the problem is that what they do is they end up freeing themselves into savagery. And this is a bit of a paradox, right? What I mean by paradox is that, well, as one commentator put it, they free themselves into an undisciplined state. They liberate themselves into a state of bondage to their chaotic and evil impulses. But the question is, how can you really be said to be genuinely free in this way? I don't know, I don't think you can. As Plato knew so well, you're most free, it would seem, precisely when you're disciplined and ordered and doing what's ultimately in your best interests. That's when you're doing what you really want and not a slave to your passions and impulses. At the end of the day, freedom is an ally, a friend of order and mutual benefit and happiness. Freedom is not individual license. When the individual good takes precedence over the communal one, then reason and cooperation falls apart and chaos ensues. And again, how can you really be free in a state of chaos? Okay, so speaking of this, clearly one of the other central themes of the novel is something that I've already hinted at, namely that of degeneration. Now, it's pretty obvious that one specific aspect of this is how the boys' initial play and fun games slowly mutates into a more and more horrible reality. I mean, at first, they're just amusing themselves and playing childish games, right? You know, like they're reenacting Treasure Island and things like that. But very gradually, these games get tinged with sadism and violence. I mean, take, for example, they're playing at pig hunting. At first, they're just pretending with each other. So one of the kids, Robert, is pretending that he's a pig, while the others are sort of playfully poking at him. But of course, this escalates into more and more. And the next thing you know, Jack has actually killed a pig. And then, of course, poor Simon is killed in a very similar fashion. Notice that here we have each episode being more savage than the one that preceded it. You know, for some reason, this reminds me a bit of something that St. Augustine mentions in his book, The Confessions. There he talks about, as a kid, stealing a pear from a neighboring vineyard. And he didn't even eat it. He went on to give it to some pigs. Now, I have to admit that this passage always confused me a bit. I mean, why was this confession taken so seriously by Augustine? Why was it so sinful to snatch a pear, especially when you don't even eat it yourself? Well, it eventually came to me. That is, maybe Augustine's thinking was something like this: that it's not the one pear in itself that makes the act so bad, but it's that if you let yourself take one, then it becomes a little bit easier to take another one. And then if you go on to take another one, it becomes even easier to take a third one, and so on. And then at the end of the day, you discover that you didn't do one mischievous but relatively innocent thing, but that you've become a thief. I don't know, it's a bit like pulling at that tiny loose string on your sweater, in the sense that probably the best thing to do is just to never start pulling in the first place if at the end of the day you still want to have something like a recognizable sweater remaining. Okay, so I guess the reason I'm saying this is because as it relates to the boys in The Lord of the Flies, it's easy to see how certain acts, playful though they may be at first, can so easily get tinged with a cruelty or with a malice they never seem to have had initially. Or in other words, that certain acts are just such that they foreshadow their more sinister transformation likely to come. I don't know, maybe this is one reason why having parents around is so important. Their authority and their presence keeps us from doing the sorts of things and getting into the sorts of habits that are best avoided early. And actually, interestingly, this is not too far from Aristotle's view on moral education. This stress, that is, on developing good habits very early on. Anyway, at the end of the day, the boys on the island paid the price for having no one around to counsel against taking that very first pear. And you know, I think that there's a related topic here, and that is the role or the impact of eating meat in this story. That is, as one commentator has suggested, Golding may be intimating to us that there's some sort of connection between eating meat and the potential for savagery. I mean, It's Jack who's not satisfied with all the fruits and the nuts on the island and instead wants meat. And is it merely a coincidence that it's this Jack who later turns into the cruelest and the least sensitive of all the kids there? I mean, it's interesting how when Jack first tries to kill the piglet, he hesitates and he makes some excuse to the other boys. But maybe that's because deep down, he and the other boys recognize the real truth of the situation. The real truth seems to be that to take that first step into cutting into living flesh is also to take the first step into an unknown world of violence and eventually sadism. And wouldn't you know it, after that first kill, it doesn't take long to see that personal change. I mean, later on in the story, as one commentator noticed, Jack is described crawling through the undergrowth on all fours like a dog, ready to pounce on and tear apart whatever moves in his sights. The blood that was not too long ago unbearable to spill has become a delight to see, and the lifeless body lying in its pool is now nothing but the expectation of a roast bellowed on a spit. Bye for now.